This bobcat rescued from the illegal pet trade. Now, he's foster dad to 14 orphaned bobcat kittens. The phone rang at 3 in the morning, shattering the silence that had become Walter Hammond's only companion. At 70 years old, he had grown accustomed to sleepless nights, to the way darkness amplified memories he'd rather forget. But this call was different. The voice that crackled through the receiver belonged to Marcus Chen, a man he hadn't spoken to in nearly 5 years. A man who had once stood beside him in the muddy trenches of their war against those who traded in suffering. "Walter," Marcus said, his voice tight with urgency. "There's a bobcat. We found it in a raid tonight. Cross-border operation. It's bad. Walt, real bad. And I know. I know you said you were done with all this. But there's something about this one. I can't explain it. It needs you." Walter sat on the edge of his bed, his calloused hand gripping the phone. Through the window, he could see the first hints of dawn threatening to break over the scrubland that stretched endlessly beyond his small ranch. The morning mist was rolling in from the south, the way it always did when the border forests exhaled their secrets into the Texas air. "Marcus, I'm 70 years old. I'm not, I know what you are," Marcus interrupted. "You're the only one who never gave up on the hopeless cases. Please, Walt, just come look at it." 2 hours later, Walter stood in the temporary field station that the task force had set up 3 miles from the Mexican border. The facility smelled of disinfectant and fear, a combination he remembered too well from his years in the field. They led him past cages containing exotic birds with clipped wings, a pair of ocelots huddled together in terror, and several young coyotes that watched him with eyes too knowing for their age. At the far end of the row, in a cage barely large enough to contain its emaciated body, lay a young bobcat. Walter had seen suffering before, had carried it in his own chest since the day his son's flag-draped coffin had returned from a war on the other side of the world. But something about this animal stopped him cold. The bobcat was barely breathing. Its tawny coat was matted and dull, marked with the unmistakable signs of prolonged captivity and abuse. But it was the eyes that held Walter transfixed. Despite the sedation, despite the obvious pain, there was something still burning in those amber depths. Not quite hope, but not quite surrender either. Something in between. Something familiar. Dr. Sarah Nguyen, the wildlife veterinarian, stood beside him with a clipboard pressed against her chest like a shield. "It's a male. Approximately 2 years old. Severe malnutrition. Dehydration. Probable kidney damage from the sedatives they were using to keep him docile. They cut his claws down to the quick, all of them. There's evidence of repeated tranquilization, probably for transport or for entertainment." She paused, and Walter could hear the weight of what she wasn't saying. "We should euthanize him. Mr. Hammond. It would be the humane thing. He's not going to make it. And even if he did, what kind of life could he have? He can't hunt. He can't climb. He can't defend himself. He'll never survive in the wild. And he's too traumatized for any kind of rehabilitation program." Walter knelt down slowly, his old knees protesting the movement. He'd learned to ignore such complaints years ago, the same way he'd learned to ignore most forms of pain. He moved closer to the cage, and close enough that he could see the rapid rise and fall of the bobcat's chest. Close enough to see the thin scar that ran down its left hind leg. His hand moved unconsciously to his own left leg, to the place where shrapnel from an improvised explosive device had torn through muscle and bone during his final tour with the anti-trafficking unit. The scar there was old now, silvered with age, but it ached on cold mornings and before rain. It ached now. "He's made it this far," Walter said quietly, his voice rough with disuse. "He survived whatever hell they put him through. He survived the raid, the chaos, the fear. He's here, and he's still breathing. No one, not you, not me, not anyone has the right to take away his last chance." "Doctor." Nguyen opened her mouth to protest, but Marcus placed a hand on her shoulder. "Let him try. Sarah, if anyone can pull off a miracle, it's Walt." The decision was made before Walter fully understood what he was agreeing to. Within a week, the bobcat had been transferred to the small wildlife sanctuary that Walter had established on his property 5 years ago. after he'd finally admitted that he couldn't stop trying to save things. The sanctuary had been quiet lately, in housing only a few permanent residents, animals too damaged to be released but not so damaged they couldn't live with dignity. He named the bobcat Robert. It seemed right somehow. A proper name for a creature that deserved to be seen as an individual rather than just another casualty. When he bathed Robert for the first time, a necessary ordeal to treat the skin infections and remove the accumulated filth of captivity, Walter discovered the full extent of the scar on his leg. It ran from hip to ankle, a silvered line that twisted and curved in a pattern that was almost identical to Walter's own war wound. Twin scar, Walter murmured, running warm water gently over the damaged fur. That's what we are, you and me. Twin scar. Robert's eyes tracked him through the bath. Never hostile, never grateful, just watching with that same burning intensity that had first caught Walter's attention. The bobcat didn't struggle, didn't fight, but he didn't relax either. He simply endured, the way Walter himself had endured so many things that couldn't be changed. The first weeks were brutal. Robert wouldn't eat unless Walter sat with him in complete silence. The bobcat would panic at sudden movements, at raised voices, at anything that resembled the chaos of his former life. But slowly, incrementally, trust began to build between them. Walter built a separate enclosure for Robert, one that took him 3 weeks of hard labor that his old body protested at every turn. He installed trees, sturdy oaks, that he transplanted from elsewhere on his property, and created a small stream that flowed from a carefully designed spring system. He positioned the shelter so that gentle morning light would filter through the branches without being harsh. And in one corner, he planted a small pine sapling. This is yours, Walter told Robert on the day he moved him into the new space. This is your place. You're safe here. Each morning, Walter would arrive at dawn, and Robert would be waiting. At first, the bobcat would retreat to the far corner, watching, but gradually, and he began to make a sound, a soft, trilling chirp that seemed to come from deep in his chest. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't fearful. It was almost conversational. Walter found himself responding, talking to Robert about everything and nothing. He told him about the weather, about the hawks he'd seen circling overhead, about the memories that kept him awake at night. He told him about Daniel, his son, who had been 23 years old when an IED had turned a routine patrol into a tragedy that still echoed through Walter's dreams. He was supposed to come home, Walter said one evening, sitting on the ground outside Robert's enclosure while the bobcat lay in a patch of fading sunlight. He was 3 weeks from the end of his deployment. 3 weeks. I had his room ready. I'd fixed up the truck he'd learned to drive in. Got it running again. I was going to teach him everything I knew about the land, about tracking, about being alive in a world that's worth living in. Robert's ears twitched, and he made that soft chirping sound again. It wasn't sympathy, animals don't traffic in such human concepts, but it was acknowledgement, it was presence, and somehow, that was enough. The breakthrough came on a cool October morning. Walter had brought a toy, a simple thing made of rope and feathers, designed to mimic prey. He'd been trying for weeks to get Robert to engage with it, to awaken some spark of the hunting instinct that should have been buried deep in the bobcat's DNA. Every attempt had failed. But that morning, something changed. Walter tossed the toy lazily across the enclosure, not expecting anything, and Robert moved. It wasn't much, just a slight crouch, a shifting of weight, but then his front paws shot out, clawless but coordinated, and he pinned the toy to the ground. Walter felt something crack open in his chest, something that had been frozen for years. It wasn't quite joy, but it was close enough that tears sprang to his eyes before he could stop them. That's it, he whispered. That's it. Twin scar. You remember. From that day forward, Robert began to heal in ways that went beyond the physical. His coat grew glossy. His eyes brightened. He moved through his enclosure with increasing confidence, learning to navigate a world without the weapons nature had given him. He couldn't hunt the way a wild bobcat could, couldn't climb with the same assurance, couldn't fight, but he was alive, and he was trying, and that was more than anyone had expected. 4 months after Robert's arrival, Marcus called again. "We've got another one," he said without preamble. Bobcat cub, maybe 4 months old. Found in a backyard in El Paso, people had been keeping it as a pet. Parents got arrested for drug possession, and the cub was in a closet. It's a mess. Walt, malnourished, socialized to humans. No survival skills. We need a place for it. Walter looked out at Robert's enclosure. Marcus, Robert's a male. Adult males don't tolerate cubs, especially ones that aren't their own. It goes against every instinct. He'll see it as a threat or competition. "I know," Marcus said, "but I also know you'll figure something out. You always do." The cub arrived 2 days later. A tiny ball of spotted fur and enormous, terrified eyes. Sarah helped Walter set up a temporary enclosure adjacent to Robert's, separated by a sturdy fence that would allow the two animals to see and smell each other without direct contact. "This is probably a mistake," Sarah said as they released the cub into its new space. "Even if Robert doesn't actively attack it, the stress could kill one or both of them." Walter didn't respond. He was watching Robert, who had emerged from his shelter and was standing at the fence line, his whole body rigid with attention. The cub Walter had named him Scout huddled in the far corner, mewling pitifully. Every wildlife manual Walter had ever read said that Robert should be hissing, growling, displaying aggression. Male bobcats were territorial. Male bobcats didn't nurture cubs that weren't their own. But Robert did something that Walter would replay in his memory for years to come. The adult bobcat opened his mouth and made a sound that Walter had never heard before, a low, rolling call that was somehow both commanding and gentle. Then, Robert lay down next to the fence, as close to Scout as the barrier would allow, and simply waited. For 3 days, Robert maintained his vigil. He would move away to eat or drink, but he always returned to the fence line, always made that soft calling sound, always watched Scout with patient, unwavering attention. On the 4th day, Scout approached the fence. The two bobcats touched noses through the wire mesh, and Walter heard Robert make that chirping sound, the same sound he'd first made to Walter all those months ago. "I'll be damned," Sarah whispered. She'd come to check on the situation, expecting to find either one dead bobcat or two animals in states of extreme distress. Instead, she found something that shouldn't have been possible. Another week passed before Walter felt comfortable allowing direct contact. He opened the gate between the enclosures on a warm November morning, ready to intervene if Robert showed any sign of aggression. Robert walked through the opening with measured steps. Scout froze, his small body tense with fear. And then Robert did something extraordinary. He approached Scout slowly, made that soft calling sound, and began to groom the cub. It wasn't the rough grooming of dominance or the mechanical cleaning of duty. It was gentle, almost tender, the way a parent would care for their young. Robert licked Scout's ears, his face, the top of his head, all while making a continuous purring rumble that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his soul. Walter sat on the ground outside the enclosure and wept. He wept for Robert, who had been broken and was now healing others. He wept for Scout, who had found safety in the most unlikely place. And he wept for himself, for the frozen places inside him that were beginning, finally, to thaw. That was the first cub. It would not be the last. Over the next 6 years, 13, more orphaned or traumatized bobcat cubs would find their way to Walter's sanctuary. Each had their own story of loss, their own catalog of human-inflicted wounds. There was Maggie, who had been declawed and kept in an apartment until her owner's landlord discovered her. There was Dusty, who had been hit by a car and lost the use of his back right leg. There was Luna, born in captivity to parents who had been taken from the wild, who knew nothing of hunting or hiding or any of the skills she would need to survive. And Robert raised them all. Walter watched in amazement as the bobcat developed what could only be described as a teaching methodology. Robert seemed to understand that each cub was different, that each required a different approach. For the timid ones, like a small female, they named Willow. Robert would make a sound that was almost like a lullaby, a gentle trilling that seemed to say, "You're safe, you're safe, you're safe." For the stubborn ones, like a headstrong male called Thunder, Robert would simply sit in silence nearby, a steady presence that couldn't be ignored or intimidated. Robert developed rituals. Each morning, he would make a specific chirping call, and the cubs, however many were in residence at the time, would emerge from their various sleeping spots in a specific order. The youngest first, then the next oldest, all the way up. It was a hierarchy built not on aggression, but on care, on Robert's intimate understanding of each cub's needs and capabilities. In the evenings, Walter would sit outside the enclosure and read aloud. Sometimes it was stories about forests and wilderness, field guides to North American mammals, accounts of animal behavior. Sometimes it was history, stories of wars and the men who fought them. He didn't know if the bobcats understood the words, but they would gather around Robert in the center, the cubs arranged around him like satellites, and listen in absolute silence. The sanctuary became known among the network of wildlife rescue organizations. When they had a bobcat that was too damaged, too traumatized, too hopeless, they would call Walter, and Walter would say yes, every time, even when his bank account dwindled, even when his body ached from the physical labor of maintaining habitats for so many animals. Sarah became a regular presence at the sanctuary, documenting Robert's behavior for a research paper she was writing on trauma recovery in wild animals. "This shouldn't be possible," she would say, again and again, while reviewing footage of Robert teaching a cub how to stalk, how to pounce, how to read the signs of danger in the forest. "Robert can't demonstrate climbing," she noted one day. "His claws are gone. But look, he's figured out a workaround." They watched as Robert guided a cub named Ash toward a fallen log. Robert would tap the log with his paw, then look at Ash meaningfully. When Ash approached, Robert would make an encouraging chirp. When Ash successfully scrambled onto the log, Robert would groom him lavishly, making that deep purring sound that they'd all come to recognize as approval. Walter built an artificial climbing structure, a series of wooden poles arranged at various angles and heights, wrapped with rope to provide grip for tiny claws. It took him 2 weeks of work, his aging body protesting every nail hammered, every board lifted. But when he was done, he had created something that the cubs could practice on, something that would give them the skills they needed for the wild. Robert would stand at the base of the structure for hours, watching as cubs climbed and fell and climbed again. He couldn't demonstrate the technique, but his presence seemed to be enough. The cubs would look down at him from their precarious perches, and he would chirp encouragement, and somehow they would find the courage to go higher. On the side of the main pole, Walter began carving names: Scout, Maggie, Dusty, Luna, Willow, Thunder, Ash. Each cub that came through the sanctuary, each life that Robert touched, was immortalized in the wood. The list grew longer with each passing year, until the pole was covered with names, until it became a testament to survival and second chances. There were failures, too. Not every cub made it. A tiny female named Sparrow died in her sleep one night from complications related to her previous malnutrition. Walter found Robert the next morning, lying beside Sparrow's small body, making a low moaning sound that Walter had never heard before. It was grief, pure and undiluted, and it cut through Walter's heart like a knife. They buried Sparrow beneath the pine tree that had grown tall and strong in the corner of Robert's original enclosure. Walter carved her name into a small stone marker, and Robert sat vigil there for 3 days, refusing food, barely drinking water. He understands. Walter told Sarah on the 3rd day, he knows she's gone. He's mourning her. Sarah nodded, her professional composure cracking. I've never seen anything like this. The depth of emotional connection, the sophistication of his responses. Walter, this is going to change how we think about these animals. But Walter didn't care about research papers or scientific significance. He cared about Robert, about the way the bobcat had transformed from a nearly dead victim into something extraordinary. He cared about the cubs who were learning to be wild again under the tutelage of an animal who could never be wild himself. One incident stood out in Walter's memory with particular clarity. A cub named Copper had gotten his leg caught in a gap in the wire mesh, a freak accident that happened despite Walter's careful maintenance of the enclosures. By the time Walter heard the distressed cries, Robert was already there. positioned between Copper and the gate, his body low and tense. When Sarah arrived to help, Robert did something shocking. He growled a deep feminine, threatening sound that Walter had never heard from him before. Sarah froze. Marcus, who had come along, reached for a tranquilizer gun. "Wait," Walter said, holding up his hand. He approached slowly, talking in the calm, measured tones that he always used with Robert. "Twin Scar. It's me. It's okay. We're here to help. You know that. Buddy. You know we're here to help." Robert's eyes locked with Walter's. For a long moment, neither moved. Then Robert stepped aside, though he continued to watch every movement as Walter and Sarah carefully freed Copper's leg. He was protecting him, Sarah said later, her voice still shaky from the adrenaline. Robert was willing to fight us people he trusts to protect that cub. Walter nodded. He understood. It was the same fierce protectiveness that he himself had felt for Daniel. The same instinct that had nearly destroyed him when he'd failed to protect his son from a war on the other side of the world. Robert had found a way to channel that protective instinct into something constructive, something healing. Walter was still learning how. The surveillance camera that Walter had installed, a grudging concession to Sarah's research, captured something remarkable one winter night. The video showed all 14 of the cubs who were currently in residence, an unusually high number. The result of a particularly successful breeding season in the wild, followed by a brutal drought that had orphaned an unusual number of young arranged around Robert's body. Each cub was touching him, somehow. Some had their heads resting on his flank. Others were pressed against his side. 2 particularly small cubs were tucked under his front legs. Robert lay completely still, his breathing slow and even, his eyes half closed. He didn't move, didn't shift position, even though the arrangement of bodies around him had to be uncomfortable. He stayed that way all night. When Walter reviewed the footage the next morning, he found himself once again crying something that had become almost commonplace since Robert had entered his life. "You're better than me," Walter told Robert later that day. "You've figured out how to love without losing yourself. I never learned that trick." Not every release was successful. Some cubs, despite months of careful rehabilitation, simply couldn't adjust to life in the wild. One cub named Rusty had been kept as a pet for so long before being rescued that he had no fear of humans. 3 attempts to release him ended the same way Rusty would immediately approach humans, seeking interaction, putting himself in danger. In the end, Walter made the difficult decision to keep Rusty permanently. He built an expansion to Robert's enclosure, giving them both more space but allowing them to stay together. Rusty became, in Sarah's words, Robert's final pupil, a permanent student who would never graduate but would live with dignity nonetheless. Rusty had a habit of climbing onto Walter's back whenever the old man sat in the enclosure, draping himself across Walter's shoulders like a very large, very heavy scarf. Walter would continue whatever task he was doing, cleaning water bowls, raking out old bedding, repairing fence sections, while Rusty purred and occasionally groomed Walter's hair with his rough tongue. "You're spoiling him," Sarah said one day, laughing as she watched Rusty claim his favorite position. "Maybe," Walter agreed. "But after what he's been through, I figure he's earned the right to be a little spoiled." There was a cub named Penny who had been born without a tail, a genetic defect that made her an outcast among the other cubs, even in captivity, even in the accepting environment of the sanctuary. The other cubs shunned her. She was different, and difference, even among animals, was cause for isolation. But Robert wouldn't allow it. He stayed beside Penny constantly, teaching her to walk with balance despite her lack of a tail, showing her how to compensate with her body positioning when she stalked prey. When the other cubs ignored her, Robert would call to her specifically, including her in activities, grooming her until her coat shone. Under Robert's tutelage, Penny learned not just to survive but to thrive. When she was finally released, a moment that Walter had privately thought would never come, she proved to be one of the most successful of all Robert's students. A collar equipped with a tracking device showed that she had established a territory, had successfully hunted, and had survived her first winter in the wild. The tailless wonder. Marcus said when they reviewed the tracking data, "Who would have thought Walter would have thought?" Because he'd watched Robert work with Penny, had seen the patient, persistent way the scarred bobcat had refused to let her give up on herself. It was the same thing Robert had done for Walter. Really refused to let him give up, even when giving up would have been easier. One spring evening, Robert did something that Walter couldn't explain. The bobcat stood on the highest rock in his enclosure and let out a long, eerily beautiful cry. It wasn't a mating call. Robert had been neutered as part of his medical treatment. It wasn't territorial. It was something else. Something that seemed to carry meaning beyond simple animal communication. The cry went on for nearly a minute, echoing across the sanctuary and into the wildlands beyond. Then Robert fell silent, his body tense, his gaze fixed on the forest in the distance. The next morning, Marcus called. "One of our released cubs, Scout, I think got clipped by a car last night. Nothing serious, but he's a bit banged up. We're keeping him for observation." Walter's blood ran cold. Scout had been released nearly 40 miles away, 2 years ago. There was no way Robert could have known about the accident. No way he could have sensed it. And yet, "What time did it happen?" Walter asked. "Around 7:30 p.m., according to the person who called it in." Why 7:30? The exact time Robert had been standing on his rock, crying out to the forest. Walter didn't tell Marcus. He knew how it would sound like an old man reading too much into animal behavior, anthropomorphizing a bobcat into something mythical. But Walter knew what he'd witnessed. He knew that somehow, in some way that defied explanation, Robert had known. Sarah had a term for it when Walter finally told her. "Extraordinary perception," she said. "There are documented cases of animals sensing things about their family members that they shouldn't be able to know. But those are usually about bonded pairs, or mothers and offspring. What Robert did, that's on another level entirely." The years accumulated. The list of names on the wooden pole grew longer. Robert's muzzle turned gray, and he moved a little more stiffly in the mornings, though he never complained, never showed distress. Walter's hair went completely white. His hands developed a tremor that made small tasks difficult. They were growing old together. Twin Scar and the man who had saved him. On a cool morning in late September, 6 years and 7 months after Walter had first knelt beside a dying bobcat in a field station near the Mexican border, something remarkable happened. Walter heard a disturbance near Robert's enclosure and went to investigate. An adult bobcat stood just beyond the fence line, in the trees that marked the boundary of the sanctuary property. It was Scout. Walter recognized him immediately from the distinctive pattern of spots on his shoulders, from the slightly notched left ear that had been marked during his initial capture and treatment. Scout had been released 4 years ago and hadn't been seen since. The adult bobcat lingered near the enclosure for 3 days. He wouldn't approach when humans were visible, but the surveillance cameras caught him in the early mornings and late evenings, pacing along the fence line. He never made a sound. He never tried to enter. He just visited. On the 4th day, Robert seemed to know something was different. He moved more slowly than usual, eating little of his breakfast. Walter found him in the early afternoon beneath the pine tree, the same tree that Walter had planted all those years ago. The same tree that had witnessed Sparrow's burial and countless other moments of joy and sorrow. Robert was lying on his side, his breathing shallow but steady. Walter sat down beside him, his old bones protesting the movement to the ground. He placed his hand on Robert's flank, feeling the rise and fall of breath, the steady beat of the heart that had somehow found a way to love despite everything. "You did good, Twin Scar," Walter said softly. "You did so good." That night, the surveillance cameras captured something that would later be studied by researchers, written about in journals, analyzed frame by frame. Scout returned to the fence line, and Robert, though clearly weak, somehow made his way to the fence to meet him. The two bobcats lay on opposite sides of the barrier, as close as the wire mesh would allow, their eyes locked. Neither moved. They stayed that way for hours, into the deep night. A goodbye that transcended species boundaries and touched something fundamental about connection and memory and love. Robert died just before dawn, lying beneath his pine tree, in the exact spot where he had first stepped into the light of Walter's enclosure all those years ago. Walter found him when he arrived for the morning feeding. The old man sat beside Robert's body and finally, fully, completely let himself grieve, not just for Robert, but for Daniel, for all the lost things and broken creatures and impossible sorrows that had shaped his life. Sarah helped with the burial. They laid Robert beneath the pine tree, wrapped in a soft blanket, his body positioned as if he were merely sleeping. Marcus came and brought 3 other members of the old task force. They stood in silence around the grave, while Walter said words that came from somewhere deep and true. He was forgotten. Walter said, the world had written him off as unsalvageable, as not worth the effort, but he survived. And more than that, he thrived. He taught us that being broken doesn't mean being finished. That scars can be maps to healing rather than monuments to pain. He raised 14 cubs, and every one of them carries a piece of him into the wild. That's not just survival, that's legacy. In the weeks that followed, something extraordinary happened. Adult bobcats began appearing near the sanctuary, not threatening, not aggressive, just present. Sarah confirmed through tracking data and visual identification that they were Robert's former students. Maggie was there, with 2 cubs of her own. Thunder appeared, marked by his distinctive broad face. Even Penny came, her lack of a tail unmistakable, leading a single cub that showed no obvious defects. They didn't enter the sanctuary. They circled it, moving through the trees at its borders, as if showing their own offspring the place that had saved them, as if introducing them to the father who had taught them what they needed to know. They remember, Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. They remember him, and they're bringing their babies to see where it all started. Walter understood. It was the same reason he still talked to Daniel's photograph every night before bed, and the same reason he kept his son's room exactly as it had been. Memory was a form of immortality. Love, even love that encompassed loss, was how we defied death. Walter lived for 3 more years after Robert's death. He continued to take in orphan cubs, though none of them filled the hole that Robert had left. He was too old now for the physical labor the sanctuary required, so Sarah helped coordinate volunteers. The place evolved, expanded, became something larger than just one old man and his impossible mission. When Walter died quietly in his sleep at the age of 79, his will contained specific instructions. Everything he owned, the land, the buildings, a lifetime of modest savings, carefully invested, was to be given to the sanctuary. There was a single note attached: never let another living creature be forgotten. A bronze statue was commissioned, depicting Robert grooming a cub, his scarred leg extended, his head bent in that characteristic gesture of care. It stands at the entrance to what is now the Hammond Robert Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. Beside it stands the wooden pole, preserved and protected, still bearing the carved names of all the cubs Robert raised. Visitors come from all over the world now. They hear the story of a bobcat who was supposed to die, but instead learned to live so fully that he taught others how to do the same. They learn about Walter, the old man who saw something worth saving in a creature everyone else had given up on. But the real legacy isn't in the statue or the stories, or even the sanctuary itself. It's in the wild places of Texas and northern Mexico, in the bobcats who carry Robert's lessons in their movements, their hunting strategies, their unexpected compassion toward the weak and wounded. It's in every cub that Scout and Maggie and Thunder and Penny raised, teaching them what Robert had taught, that survival is not the same as living, and that the most wounded among us, when given love and time and patience, can heal not just themselves but entire generations. On certain spring evenings, when the light hits just right and the border forests exhale their mist across the land, staff at the sanctuary swear they can hear it, that distinctive chirping call that Robert used to make, echoing from somewhere in the wild. It's probably just wishful thinking, just the human need to find meaning in loss. But then again, maybe not. Maybe some bonds are too strong to be severed by something as simple as death. Maybe love, real love, becomes part of the land itself, woven into the very fabric of the world. Twin scar, 2 scars, 2 souls, 2 lives that should have ended, but instead found a way to heal each other. That's the story. That's the miracle. Not that they survived, but that they taught the rest of us what survival really means.